Welcome to Behind the Lens, an ongoing conversation about all things in Eugene relating to film. My guest today is an old friend and a very well-respected film practitioner here in Eugene. This is, what was your name again?
Neal Miller.
I've heard that, yes. Neal and I have been friends for, what, 8 or 10 years.
Yeah, at least, yeah.
And that he and I worked together founding the Shaggy Dog Project.
Yes.
Quite a while ago. But we're here to talk not about the Shaggy Dog Project,
right,
but about Neal Miller.
Okay.
So, Neal, where did you start in your career of film?
Well, I grew up in Chicago, as you know, and ended up studying engineering. Got a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering at Illinois, and went on to get a master's degree in a field called operations research, which is part of engineering, at Illinois Institute of Technology. And I pursued that for quite a while, working for some large corporations as an information technology and systems person.
What was the thing that brought you toward the entertainment industry?
Well, at one point, I bounced around quite a bit, and at one point I was managing a venture capital fund, and I met a man who was working for a commercial finance company, and he was providing some gap financing for Joe Levine, the big producer out of New York. Films like The Graduate, The Lion and Winter, The Producers, things like that. And through that friendship, I eventually decided I wanted to have my own business, and I started renovating Victorian buildings in Chicago. And I called this fellow, Bob Greenberg, and we had lunch to talk about a real estate deal, and all we did was talk about film. And I went back to his office after lunch, and there were stacks of screenplays, and I was very curious. I said, could I read some of these? And in typical fashion, I said, oh, heck, I could write as well as this. And so I started, we had a project called The Tap that a fellow had come in. I helped put together a little film fund to develop screenplays with Bob. And the fellow came in with this storyline, the Tap, about a young man who learns how to tap into other people's computers. We're talking about the early 70s here. That wasn't that well known. Anyway, I wrote a 60-page treatment because this fellow just couldn't follow through and really write the screenplay. Had a great idea, but that was about it. In any case, it had made the rounds. It came out to LA to a few people, and nothing ever happened. And about 4 years later, it came out as a film called War Games. Mm-hmm. And it was essentially the treatment that I had written. And I decided, some people, including the director of the film, when he read what I had written, advised me to sue. And I said, you know, that's not a way to get into the film business through a lawsuit, but I'll just take it as a compliment that the idea was good enough to copy. Anyway, I got motivated to do a little 30-minute, I had an idea to do a series of, at that time Bob Geller had come out with the American Short Story series, which was very well received on PBS. I figured that if I was going to get into film, this experience with Hollywood just didn't sit very well with me. So I decided I thought network television I'm going to run into the same kind of problem. So I decided to go for something on PBS and do a series. I happened to make a friend in Chicago who was producing stuff for WTTW, the public television station there. In fact, she was the original producer of Sneak Previews, the original Siskel Ebert show. Anyway, Thea liked my ideas, but she couldn't get the PBS station to help me get something done.
Why was that?
Well, they thought I would be competing for drama money with them, with their station, and in a way they were right. But anyway, I did a little half-hour film. I got the rights to a story that I liked very much, and I produced it, a very short, a half-hour show. We couldn't find we couldn't find the female lead. I was looking for a 17-year-old girl.
What was the show?
It's called the Charles C. Charlie is the name of the. It was Grace Paley's story, and I met Grace, and I got the rights to do that film. And but we were having so much trouble casting the lead. So the cinematographer says to me, "You know, I just shot something for a family here in town, and with the young daughter loves horses, and she might be good for this." I said, "Well, you know, she only lived a couple blocks away from my office." And I said, "Well, have her come over." Well, Daryl Hannah walked in the door, and that was it. So I happened to get Daryl in her first film. The film itself was a disappointment. The guy who wrote and directed it had done documentaries for BBC, and he didn't quite get it. But I learned a great deal by re-editing the film with a really good editor, and I learned more about filmmaking just going through all the footage and the editing process. Couldn't get, as I say, the interest of TTW, so Thea, the producer of Sneak Previews, put me in touch with the then president of PBS, and she came out, she looked at the film. I told her what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a short story series called Sense of Humor, based on contemporary authors, American authors, whereas Bob Geller's film had taken international famous short stories, classics. I wanted to do contemporary stuff, and I wanted to do humor. So we, the woman, and I've spaced on her name right now, came out to Chicago, looked at what I had done, and suggested I go into the market that they, at that point, there were once a year 270 program managers from PBS got together and put money that they got from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting into various series. It was like McNeil and Sesame Street and all the big series. But they accepted 60 applicants out of, I think, 300 and some submissions, most of them by television stations. And I was number 59. So we were invited to go to, at that time it was San Francisco, to present the series idea to the 270 program managers. You do it before 30 or 40 at a time. And they liked the idea, but I told them I wasn't going to show them this little half-hour film I had done. And so they said, well, you know, we don't fund pilots, and thanks very much, but no thanks. And so I came back, and I started optioning stories by Kurt Vonnegut and Ray Bradbury and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was obviously one who was not contemporary, but John Updike. And I was having a real hard time negotiating the rights to these stories to get the film rights. And Ray Bradbury turned out to be a big help. It turned out Bob Greenberg, the fellow I had been working with, knew someone who knew Ray and put me in touch with Ray, and he agreed to a certain price for the option and the purchase. And that sort of iced it, because then I could get Vonnegut and I could get Updike, and I got a bunch of short stories. And I picked one by a story that was based on an unfinished novel by Shirley Jackson, who wrote The Lottery,
Right.
and a very famous American writer. It was not a finished piece. And I just got this idea to approach Joanne Woodward with it, because I had heard she did a film for AFI, American Film Institute. She had done an episode of a series.
As a director.
As a director. And Joanne loved this Shirley Jackson story. And so she...
What was the name of this story?
Come Along With Me.
Mm-hmm.
About a clairvoyant woman, and Joanne got Estelle Parsons, Barbara Baxley, Sylvia Sidney, wonderful actresses, to come in, and Joanne agreed. And that's when I spent a lot of time with her and her husband, Paul Newman, working on the screenplay. And Paul did a voiceover for the piece. And I couldn't raise any money. You know, I tried and tried, and I just couldn't. And the time is rolling, and so I sold a building that I owned, because I was doing renovation of Victorian buildings at that time. I sold all my stock. I borrowed money. We thought we had enough for a 3-week shooting schedule, and we ran out of money after the first week. And so the production manager said, look, you don't have to pay the invoices for these people who are working on the film for 10 days after they bill you. That'll give us enough time to finish the film. And so I sat down with everybody, the whole crew, the cast, and I explained I had the possibility of getting some investment money now. Would they agree to continue with the film? And they did, they agreed. I ended up getting a couple of investors in it and was able to pay everybody for that. Then came the next round of this market for PBS, and I submitted it again. I said, but now I've got something to show.
Yeah.
And they allowed us to do a 10-minute sampler of the film. And I hired a guy who cut commercials. I figure if I get someone who really knows how to work in limited time frame, I have a shot here. And we were only working with the work print. We didn't even have finished footage yet. And we put together that sampler, and that year, out of the 60, I was number 37. And we went to Houston and for the market that year. And everybody loved that little 10-minute sampler. I mean, every time we showed it, there was applause. They were just... But that was the first year the American Playhouse series had come in for financing. And everybody kept saying, look, you can't compete with American Playhouse. It's owned by WNET New York and GBH in Boston and KCET in LA and the South Carolina Educational Network. That was the drama producing entity in the US. So everybody kept saying to American Playhouse, you got to take sense of humor into American Playhouse, and they refused. And so my wife and I just kept watching this thing building. Every time we'd show the film, there was this huge outcry for American Playhouse to take sense of humor into its own series. Excuse me. And they kept refusing.
But there has to be an end to this story.
I'm sorry. Came time for the final lunch. President of PBS comes to me and says, I just told Dave Davis at American Playhouse, if he doesn't take sense of humor into his series, we're not going to give him the money. Even if they vote to give him the money, I'm not going to give him any. Well, at the luncheon at the end, it was unprecedented. They said that there was the general consensus that American Playhouse should take sense of humor. And Dave Davis from Playhouse stood up. He said, I've already called a meeting of the Board of Governors, and we're going to give Neal 3 films and an option for 3 more. And we didn't need an airplane to fly back to Chicago. That's how I got into the business.
Yeah, you did the 3 films. Did you do the 3 more?
Yep. I ended up doing 6. Nobody had done more than one film for American Playhouse. I did 6. And after Come Along With Me, which was part of the deal, which saved us from going into bankruptcy, because I was in big debt after shooting that, but everybody did get paid. Then we did Who Am I This Time, which is an amazing story in itself, how we got that going. But I got Susan Sarandon and Chris Walken, and I lost my director a week before we were about to shoot. And there was a friend I had made at ABC suggested Jonathan Demme, and I said, my God, how can I get, and it was a very interesting thing that went on there. For his agent was in the process of flying to New York to meet Jonathan, and I got a script to her. Jonathan called me, said, I'm coming out. He looked at what I had done with Come Along With Me, and we delayed production 1 week, and we shot that film, and it's won many, many awards.
It's still around.
Still around, yes, exactly. In fact, I am in the process of doing a feature-length version of that story by that's Kurt Vonnegut's story. Then we did Any Friend of Nicholas Nickleby, a Friend of Mine, Ray Bradbury, the one that I had worked out with Ray, starring Fred Gwinn, and then after that did A Matter of Principle with Alan Arkin and his wife Barbara Dana, and then we did The Roommate, which is a John Updike story, and then I got my first directing work in that film, because we didn't finish it because we needed a weather change and the director wasn't available, so I directed it. And then
that was The Roommate?
That was The Roommate. And then the last one I did for Playhouse was Under the Biltmore Clock, which is an F. Scott Fitzgerald story. I wrote and produced most of those, and then I directed Under the Biltmore Clock. And that was, I guess I got started. Those films won awards. I mean, The Roommate was actually in the very first Sundance Festival.
Wonderful.
Redford had just taken over the USA Film Festival, I think it was called, in Park City. And we were...
that was the birth of Sundance.
It was the birth of Sundance, yeah. And so that's really how I got into the business.
All right, at that point, were you still living in Chicago?
Still living in Chicago, and it was shortly after that we moved to Eugene, and but I had written a screenplay that Thea Flom, that producer friend of mine, had submitted to ABC as an after-school special. It was about teenage dating violence, and it was a subject I was very interested in. I have 3 daughters, and so we got the green light on that. So I left Eugene and went back to Chicago, and we shot that there, and that won an award. And then I did another. I had a screenplay that I had, and I had rights, an option to rights by a story by Isaac Asimov called The Bicentennial Man, and it was a very big budget thing, and there was no way to get it done independently, and ultimately, well, actually Spielberg showed some interest in it, and I ended up going down to their studio. And they were on the Universal lot, and they said, well, we're going to have to pass on this because we're working on a similar kind of story. It was AI that they were doing. But then Michael Jackson showed a lot of interest in it, and I thought that might be wonderful. That would be a real shift. But he was busy doing a big video at that time, and we kept getting delayed and delayed. And in the meantime, it had been submitted to Disney, and they had passed on it. But a friend of mine from Chicago had gone to work for Disney and said, look, let me present it. And he did, and they grabbed it. And it got on the fast track all of a sudden.
This is Bicentennial Man.
Bicentennial Man, yeah. And they bought my script, and I was made a producer. And then the nightmare began. I mean, they said, well, we normally take about 7 years to get a film into production, and it was one of the worst experiences in my life, because they just didn't get it. It is a story about a robot that has very special qualities, and it's a fascinating story, and I envisioned it as something comparable to 2001 or Blade Runner.
Essentially, Bicentennial Man
Yeah.
is the story of a android or a robot
Yeah.
who achieves self-consciousness
Yes.
and then decides he wants to be human.
Exactly. Yeah,
Oh,
you got it, Tom.
Right.
Yeah, he. And so, in order to, the robot lives. This story takes place over a 200-year period, and ultimately he wants the world court to declare him a human.
Yeah.
And a member of the same family that he was still involved with said they're never going to do it, because they can accept an immortal machine, but they're never going to accept an immortal human. So he went, and he had, without telling anyone, he had this special operation done to allow his power supply to drain, thereby allowing him to die, which would prove that he's human.
Makes it kind of a downer, though, for Disney, doesn't it?
Well, you know, they couldn't get it together. I mean, they went through several writers, and finally the president of Disney said, look, what are we going to do here? First of all, he didn't want to have the robot die in the end. I said, Dave, that's the story. I mean, that's what it's all about. And he just couldn't accept that. And finally, he asked me what we should do, and I said, I'll write you a plot summary, which I did. And the robot, of course, dies in the end. And I then added several films that Disney had done, like Old Yeller and where the protagonist dies in the end. And he said, okay, all right, we're going to do it. The robot's going to die. And then they proceeded to hire another writer, and I didn't realize at the time they bought my script. He put it in a drawer and never told anyone that they had bought my screenplay. I actually had an amazing experience there with a producer at Disney, who had a very brief meeting with me, and he said, we love this story, but your screenplay is too close to the story. I mean, I just couldn't believe my ears, but that's just the way they think sometimes.
It makes sense to them.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But anyway, long story short, they ended up butchering the film. I mean, I got a call. When I saw the first dailies, I told them, forget about me being involved with this, because I mean, they had Robin Williams dressed up like the Tin Man, and it was a silly movie they were making, and I withdrew from it, and I was invited to the premiere. And Nick Kazan, Elia Kazan's son, eventually wrote the screenplay. I think they paid him $1 million to write it. And he called me and said, I just learned that you wrote a screenplay. And you're up being considered for the screenwriting credit. I said, come on, I've seen the dailies, and this is not the screenplay I wrote. But anyway, 1 out of the 3 Writers Guild judges thought I should get a credit, but I didn't.
You had a producer credit.
I had a producer credit, but then I ended up sitting at the premiere with Nick Kazan, and he did nothing but swear at Chris Columbus, the director, for what he did to his screenplay. So this was my one and only experience with studios in
Hollywood.
In Hollywood, yeah.
Well, your career has never been dependent on Hollywood.
No.
It has found its place in public television and in independent production.
Yeah.
And once Bicentennial Man was out and distributed, you were here in Eugene and you made another picture with Alan Arkin.
Yeah, we found he and his wife, who after I had written the script, they said, we love these characters, Flagg and Ada Purdy. Love to do them again. And I found another story by that same writer, John, oh God, excuse me, I can't remember John's last name. But
the name of the film
was called Raising Flagg. After Flagg is F-L-A-G-G. Flagg Purdy was the character Alan played.
Alan Arkin.
Alan Arkin. But he and his wife Barbara Dana had gotten divorced at that point, so I didn't think we could get this going. But they said, no, we really want to work together. And so this is after I had written the screenplay. And so we ended up, I couldn't raise any money. It's very difficult to get money together. So my wife and I ended up, we already had an incredible cast together and crew, and I wanted to shoot it in Eugene, but we would have to bring in so many people, the budget just would go
big.
Right.
So where did you shoot it?
We ended up shooting outside of Portland, a couple of small towns, St. Helens, and a couple of smaller places like that. One day we shot half a day in Portland, but we ended up financing it ourselves. We had to mortgage a couple of properties we owned and to get the money together, but we ended up getting it done. Won several awards at film festivals, but the reviewers didn't like it, and Alan didn't like it, and he decided he wasn't going to support it, so it was not a good experience.
Well, that's the nature of a career in film.
It is.
Is that you win some and you lose some.
Exactly.
The thing is that you made the picture, it was successful in being what it was made of.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's been seen, it's been on cable, it's been distributed in various...
Yeah, it's mostly on digital platforms now, yeah. But it's one of those things where it's very difficult when you sit in an audience of 300 people at a film festival and they're just laughing and carrying on, and you win the Best Audience Best Picture Award, and then the critics just tear it apart.
All right, well, we're out of time, so I have to say thank you now. But we hope to speak to you again, because I know you're not done.
Right.
Anyhow, thank you, Neal.
Thank you, Tom.